Front cover: Madonna and Child with St. John the Baptist, detail of the Madonna and Child, by Sandro Botticelli, 1444 to 1510. 500 years after his death in 1510, the Florentine artist Botticelli continues to delight our gaze with his moving paintings of the Virgin and Child. His Madonnas reveal a haunting beauty of almost unearthly grace and gentle melancholy. Dating from Botticelli's early years, this painting depicts the mother and child in a moment of tender intimacy. Amongst the great Renaissance masters, Botticelli remains unrivaled in expressing the humanity of Christ. The child's adoring gaze and pudgy hand that seeks comfort evoke the innocence and vulnerability of childhood, which would have been felt acutely at a time of high infant mortality. Our identification with the mother and child rests on our emotional response to the charming scene before us. As we register the delicate flush of the Virgin's cheek, or the muted golden tones of her hair beneath a translucent veil, Botticelli's appeal to our senses draws us ever closer to the figures created by his artistry. Even the setting of a rose bower reminds us of the sweetness of the Virgin, whose titles included that of Rosa Mystica. Botticelli's enchanting vision of the Virgin and Child invites us to enter an ethereal world where the delicate fragrance of roses evokes the mystery at the heart of the Incarnation. January: Madonna of the Shadows, detail of Saints John the Evangelist, Thomas Aquinas, Lawrence and Peter Martyr, by Fra Angelico, around 1450. The observant Dominican convent of San Marco in Florence features a number of the Dominican artist Fra Angelico's most famous paintings. Now a museum, the convent passed from the Benedictines to the Dominicans in the early 15th century. The four saints depicted form part of a larger fresco known as the Madonna of the Shadows. The positions of the saints, all of whom except St. Lawrence look to the right, are motivated by the position of the Virgin and Child, who are seated on a throne in the centre of the composition, which is not included in this detail. Both saints, Lawrence and Peter Martyr, standing on Lawrence's left, suffered martyrdom, as symbolised by the palms they carry. St. Lawrence was stoned to death as recorded in the Book of Acts, and the Dominican friar Peter Martyr, around 1205-52, was murdered by 2 assassins. Peter is often shown with a bloody wound to his head, a reference to the assassin's mortal sword attack upon the friar. The fresco Madonna of the Shadows occupies a prominent position in the section of the convent where the friars and novices lived. As the Dominicans left the individual cells where they slept and studied, they entered the corridor where this fresco is placed. Communal prayer featured in the daily rhythm of the friar's life. Every evening, they would gather in front of this image of the Virgin and saints to chant the office of Matins. As they prayed and gazed upon Fra Angelico's figures, the friars must surely have imagined themselves participating in a timeless worship of Christ and his mother. February: The Presentation in the Temple, by Fra Angelico, 1442. Fra Angelico, with the assistance of other artists, frescoed scenes from the life of Christ in the cells which made up the dormitories of the Dominican friars of San Marco. This detail of the Presentation in the Temple comes from cell 10. The life-size figures dominate the small space of the room, where the friar would spend much of the day in study and prayer. The story which appears in Luke's Gospel narrates how Mary and Joseph bring the infant Jesus to the temple in Jerusalem to be consecrated to the Lord. Joseph presents a basket with 2 turtle doves as an offering to the temple, as required by Mosaic law after the birth of a firstborn son. The tongues of flame flickering at the centre of the altar remind us of this sacrifice. Fra Angelico depicts the moment when Simeon, a devout old man, receives the very vision of the Messiah which God had promised him before his death. Fra Angelico shows Simeon holding Christ while gazing at the child. The old man's expression recalls the words Luke gives to Simeon. "Master, now you are dismissing your servant in peace according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all peoples." Together with Mary and Joseph, the artist includes two other figures. At left, St. Peter Martyr, and opposite him, Blessed Villana, a 14th century holy woman of Florence. The two saints function as intermediaries between the viewer in front of the scene and the holy figures depicted. Like the friar who every day contemplated the scene, St. Peter Martyr and the Blessed Villana dwell on this episode from the infancy narrative. Their faces radiate absorption in God's revelation of his gift of salvation to his steadfast follower Simeon and to all humanity. March, the Last Supper, detail of Judas, Christ, and the Apostles, by Domenico Ghirlandaio, around 1486. Refectory of San Marco, Florence. The Last Supper held a prominent place in Florentine art during the Renaissance. The subject was a favourite choice to decorate the refectory of monasteries and friaries. Ghirlandaio treated the story several times, this version being commissioned by the Dominicans for their refectory at San Marco. It's not surprising that the subject of the Last Supper became a staple of refectory decorations. The drama of Christ's instruction to the apostles to remember him in the breaking of the bread and the drinking of wine dramatises the centrality of the Eucharist in Christian life. The story also features the moment of Judas's betrayal, which of course sets in motion the events that lead to Christ's arrest, trial, and crucifixion. Ghirlandaio locates Judas's treachery at the centre of the narrative. As we see in the detail reproduced here, Judas sits isolated across from Christ and the other apostles. By showing Judas with a sop of bread in his hand, Ghirlandaio recalls Christ's words that the one who will betray him is he to whom I shall give this morsel when I have dipped. In contrast to Judas, the youthful sleeping figure of St. John the Evangelist, the one lying close to his breast, evokes John's innocence and fidelity that will persist even after the other apostles have deserted Jesus. For the Dominicans and their lay visitors who dined in front of this fresco, the reenactment of Judas's betrayal must surely have caused a few pangs of soul-searching. April, The Annunciation, by Andrea Solario, 1506. Visual images of Christ and the Virgin were a familiar part of people's lives during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Undoubtedly, the scene of the Annunciation must rank together with that of the Crucifixion as the most popular subjects of visual art during this period. The dimensions of this panel painting suggest that this work might well have decorated a domestic interior, perhaps a bedchamber. At the time, many moderately well-off lay people commissioned works of art for their homes. Subjects like the Annunciation were especially popular for men and women who wished to pray and meditate before devotional images. Solario locates the narrative in an interior space which resembles the domestic space of a bedroom through the rather grand curtained bed behind the Virgin. Mary sits in front of a table on which we glimpse several books. Her left hand rests on an open volume, reminding us of the legend attesting to her constant meditation on Scripture. Importantly, by showing the Virgin engaged in prayerful devotion, Solario presents her as a model above all for lay women. Mary calmly accepts Gabriel's astonishing message outlining her role as mother of the Saviour. Both her physical demeanour and her facial expression convey Mary's acknowledgement of Gabriel's message, together with her acceptance of God's invitation. This North Italian artist, who spent most of his career in Milan, infuses the story of the Annunciation with an intimacy calculated to please his contemporaries. By situating the Incarnation within a domestic interior, Solario reminds us how often the sacred erupts into ordinary moments of life. May. The Holy Trinity with St. John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, Tobias and the Angel. Detail of the Holy Trinity, St. John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene. By Sandro Botticelli, around 1490 to 1495. Botticelli painted this altarpiece featuring the Trinity to decorate the high altar of the church of the female convent dedicated to Saint Elizabeth in Florence. The convent had been founded in the 14th century, especially for former prostitutes, known as convertite, and also for women fleeing abusive relationships. The detail of the painting featured here depicts the upper half of the work. The Trinity appears in the centre of the composition in the form known as the Throne of Mercy. In this iconographic formula, which dates from the early 12th century, God the Father supports the crucified Christ, while the dove, as symbol of the Holy Spirit, rests between the heads of Father and his Son. Mary Magdalene appears at our left, opposite John the Baptist, who traditionally is identified through his costume, the tunic made of animal skin and the cross he carries. The cult of both these saints flourished in Florence during the 15th century. John the Baptist did so because of his status as one of the major patrons of the city. The position of the Magdalene in the place of privilege at the right hand of God attests to the nuns' special devotion to her. Following a tradition dating back to at least the 6th century, the Church in the West believed that 3 different women, Mary Magdalene, who Christ delivered from demons, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed woman who anointed Christ in the house of the Pharisee, were in fact the same woman. According to this interpretation, Mary Magdalene, before her conversion in the house of the Pharisee, had been a prostitute. According to legend, after the Ascension she travelled to France, together with Martha and Lazarus, to preach. After 30 years spent evangelizing, she retired to the wilderness to live as a hermit. The Magdalene appears here gesturing in adoration and covered with her own hair, a reference to her time in the wilderness. In her role as penitent prostitute, the Magdalene became a powerful model of God's forgiveness. Not surprisingly, institutions established to help women escape prostitution frequently invoked the intercession of the Magdalene. Many women and men took great comfort from the fact that it was to the Magdalene, a penitent sinner, that Christ had first appeared after the resurrection. Equally important, the Magdalene undertook to announce her Master's resurrection to the apostles, hence her title, Apostle to the Apostles. June. Miracles of St. Paul at Ephesus by Jean Restu, 1693. Ephesus, an ancient city located on the coast of Anatolia, must have been a bustling cosmopolitan centre when St. Paul visited on the last of his 3 missionary journeys. For centuries, Ephesus had been the centre of the cult of Artemis, and according to reports in Acts 19, devotees of magic and sorcery exercised their wiles on the desperate and gullible. The French painter Jean Restu depicts St. Paul standing in the centre of a grand building, perhaps the synagogue. Although we are familiar with Paul's activities as preacher, in this work, Restu chooses to emphasise the saint's miraculous intercessory powers. A youth carrying a white cloth approaches St. Paul. The book of Acts narrates how the sick were healed by fabrics, such as aprons or napkins, which St. Paul had touched. At the lower right, a young man confined to a litter bed implores the saint to intercede on his behalf. In contrast to the anguished gestures of those around him, St. Paul remains somewhat detached from the emotions which roil around him. Instead of focusing his attention on those around him, he looks upward. his upturned gaze reminding us how utterly Paul depended on God. July. The Apostle St. James the Greater freeing the magician Hermogenes, by Fra Angelico, around 1427. The Apostle St. James the Greater, the son of Zebedee and brother of St. John the Evangelist, was venerated throughout Europe as the patron saint of pilgrims. Located in the Cathedral of Compostela in northern Spain, his shrine attracted thousands of pilgrims who made their way from all parts of Europe on what we now call the Camino, or the Pilgrim's Way. During the Middle Ages, the most important source for stories about the lives of the saints was a book written by Dominican Fra Jacobus de Varagine. This collection, known as the Golden Legend, survives in hundreds of copies, a testament to its immense popularity. This scene, depicted by Fra Angelico, closely follows the account in the Golden Legend. According to the legend, after the Ascension, St. James travelled to Spain preaching and evangelizing the local people. On his return to Jerusalem, he ordered a Christian convert, Philetus, to free the repentant magician Hermogenes, around whom demons had wound a rope that the magicians had intended to use to ensnare St. James. Fra Angelico places the scene of deliverance in an outdoor setting, where the central characters stand in front of an elegant loggia, typical of contemporary Renaissance architecture. St. James the Greater, whom we recognise by his large gold halo, extends his staff towards the convert Philetus. By his action, St. James empowers Philetus to perform the spiritual act, which will defeat the demons and free Hermogenes. At the left, behind the magician, the demons recoil in frustration. Fra Angelico uses brilliant tones of red and blue to link the three central characters and to entrance our eye. The striking scarlet of the magician's cloak contrasts with the more muted crimson of the saint's mantle. Fra Angelico was renowned for his mastery of colour as both decorative and a descriptive tool. August. Madonna delle Umbre, Madonna of the Shadows, detail of Saint Dominic, by Fra Angelico, 1450. The figure of Saint Dominic, from which this detail is taken, forms part of a larger fresco known as Madonna of the Shadows, also featured in January. Appropriately, the founder of the Order of Preachers, as the Dominicans were known, Dominic stands in the place of honour on the right of the enthroned Virgin and Child, who are seated in the centre of the composition, which is not included in this detail. Dominic's gaze is directed outward, towards the friars who would have gathered to pray in front of the fresco. This visual address to the viewer establishes a psychological and spiritual bond in which the painted and real world momentarily intersect. This sense of shared space and time gets reinforced by the way Fra Angelico suggests the movement of light, and thus passage of time, through the play of light and shadows on Saint Dominic's youthful face. Our gaze responds to his penetrating gaze, as if he is inviting us to join him and the friars in prayer. Thus, our meditation on this image becomes one with that of all those who have gone before us. September. The Three Archangels and Tobias, by Filippino Lippi, around 1457 to 1504. Throughout the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, devotion to the archangels Michael, Gabriel and Raphael occupied a special place in the lives of many people. As this painting by the Florentine artist Filippino Lippi shows, such a devotion often found expression in visual form. In Lippi's work, it is the Archangel Raphael who takes centre stage. This emphasis on Raphael and his youthful companion Tobias alludes to the apocryphal book of the Old Testament, the Book of Tobit. The story narrates the adventures of Tobias, the son of a devout Jew, Tobit. Instructed by his father, who had mysteriously lost his sight, Tobias travels to Medina in order to redeem loans owed to Tobit. Tobias finds a travelling companion in Raphael, who has disguised himself as a mortal. Throughout the often difficult and dangerous journey, Raphael protects the young Tobias in his quest to fulfill his father's instructions. Tobias's attribute of a fish alludes to an episode on the journey. When the young man is bathing in the river Tigris, he is suddenly attacked by a giant fish. Miraculously, Tobias is saved, and following Raphael's instructions, he removes the heart, liver, and gall of the fish. Raphael carries them in a box in his right hand. Thanks to the healing properties of the fish, Tobit's eyesight will be restored. Lippi focuses the painting on the close relationship between the young Tobias and his supernatural companion. As the angel leads the inexperienced traveller, Raphael's attentive pose evokes his mission as divine protector. At the left, Michael holds his saintly attributes of a sword and orb, while on the right, Gabriel holds the lily, which identifies him as a participant in the Annunciation. The story resonated especially with merchants, who in the course of business were forced to travel far from home. Families often invoked Tobias and the archangel Raphael in order to protect husbands, fathers and sons who had embarked upon arduous travels. Paintings like Lippi's and those of other artists testify to the faith such families placed in these divine protectors and messengers. October. The Vision of Saint Bruno. Detail of Saint Bruno. By Giovanni Francesco Barbieri, known as Guercino, 1647. Guercino painted this work for the charter house of the Carthusians in Bologna. Saint Bruno, the founder of the Order of Carthusians, lived around 1033 to 1101. Renowned for their asceticism, the Carthusians usually founded their houses in remote locations, in imitation of the first Carthusian foundation, the Grande Chartreuse, situated in the mountains above Grenoble. As a result, the landscape of the wilderness became a central motif in Carthusian writing and spirituality. Guercino alludes to this theme by situating the saint's vision in a rugged mountain setting. Gesture and expression capture the mood of intense spiritual engagement. Bruno's hands rest against his chest, a gesture which traditionally alluded to the heart as the centre of religious devotion. His upturned face conveys an expression of yearning, even spiritual longing. A vision of the Virgin and Child, which has triggered Bruno's ecstatic behaviour, appears in the upper half of the painting, which is not included in the detail reproduced here. Guercino inserts various traditional aids to meditation, like the crucifix, book, and the skull. The theme of the Passion, together with an emphasis on the transience of human life, as confirmed by the presence of the skull, dominated the spirituality of this period. November. Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Detail of Saint Catherine. By Raphael, 1507 to 1508. Raphael's painting of St. Catherine of Alexandria dates from the end of the period where he was working in Florence before he moved to Rome. To place a standing female saint in a landscape marks a significant departure from earlier depictions of saints and holy figures. Raphael expresses St. Catherine's yearning for union with Christ in a visual language immersed in the beauty of the natural world. St. Catherine, whose cult was popular throughout Europe, achieved sanctity as a virgin martyr during the reign of the Roman Emperor Maxentius in the early 4th century. Believed to be of royal birth, Catherine secretly converted to the Christian faith. Suitors, including the emperor, were attracted to her great beauty and learning. Catherine steadfastly rejected their proposals of marriage, instead vowing herself to a heavenly bridegroom, Christ. Catherine resisted the emperor's efforts to undermine her faith. Her determination and fidelity to Christ so infuriated Maxentius that he sentenced her to death. Although she miraculously survived a series of grisly torments, she was eventually beheaded. Raphael imagines St. Catherine in a moment of intimate mystical engagement with her divine spouse. In keeping with Renaissance principles, the painter insists on locating this supernatural event in this world, the realm of human experience. The saint turns her head so that her gaze is directed towards light that streams from the sky above. She is illuminated by light, which symbolises the divine presence in the world. Thus, both Catherine and by extension the physical world receive the gift of God's love, epitomised by the light which illumines her face. December. Adoration of the Shepherds. Detail of Mary and the Christ Child by Agnolo Bronzino, 1539 to 1547. 16th century art in Florence was shaped by the taste of the Medici rulers. Agnolo Bronzino became a favourite artist of this elegant and sophisticated court. His oil painting on panel depicts the scene of the Nativity with a refinement and taste for luxury that finds expression in gem-like colours and impossibly elegant idealised figures whose poses seem almost frozen. Despite this rather crowded composition, our attention is drawn to the Christ child and his mother. Adoring figures, including shepherds and angels, direct our gaze to the centre, where we find the tiny figure of the Christ child. Through poses that range from Mary's prayerful gesture to the rapt attention of the shepherd at our right, all those present acknowledge the mystery of the birth of Jesus as a sign of God's gift to humanity. Even the shepherds, conversing amongst themselves, seem subdued by the event. The bagpipe that the shepherd holds was traditionally associated with the rough and tumble world of those on the margins of society, such as shepherds. For as we know from the accounts in the Gospels, the message of Christ's birth and saving mission was announced equally to those at the edge of society as well as the educated and well-connected.